Benvenuto al professor Wang Feng e lo ringraziamo molto per essere qui a presentare un libro che reputiamo molto importante in se stesso e anche per il momento internazionale che stiamo attraversando, che è un momento di disordine mondiale e di caos. Quindi speriamo che questo libro ci aiuti anche a capire quello che è avvenuto e forse anche quello che avverrà. Quindi molte grazie anche a tutti voi per essere venuto e do la parola al professor Livi Bacci, a cui dobbiamo questa bella conferenza.
Grazie Presidente. Thank you so much. Okay, does it work? Can you hear me? Okay, thank you very much for being here. I am very happy to present to you Professor Wang Feng. He is a member of this academy. He's a foreign member of the Categoria Settima of this political social sciences. And Wang Feng, it's a friend of mine, of course, and we have have had a long relations in the area of sociology and demography. And he's a sociologist, professor at the University of California at Irvine, and also a professor at the Fudan University. And he's a member of many institutions, learned institutions. I'm not going to read all his memberships and the organism of which he has been active part. But let me just say a few words about his work. He's a sociologist and a demographer. And this book is a book of, it's a real book of sociology of China, China's Age of Abundance. It's a book very well written, that gives a comprehensive idea of the big change that China has undergone in the last half a century. And Wang Feng has played an important leadership role also, because he has worked on, in China with Chinese colleagues, on the issue of the one-child policy. And he has been with a group of academicians, Chinese academicians. I think he has disseminated the idea that in the long run, the one-child policy was going to be not an asset, but a weight for the China's society. And I think he has had a role in the decisions that the Chinese government has taken in 2015 to dismiss or to start destructuring the policy, the one-child policy. I think this role has been very important, and I think there are very few sociologists who have had an impact on let's say, on the policy of their own countries as Wang Feng has had on China. About a quarter of a century ago, he wrote a very interesting book, with James Lee, China, 1/4 of humanity, if I'm correct, 25 years ago. And in that book, it traced the origin of the history of the population of China from the 17th century to modernity. And I think it has been an innovative piece of work and extremely, extremely interesting for all those who are interested in Chinese history. Well, I'm not going to steal more time from Wang Feng, and I just ask you to take the floor, and you have half an hour for the presentation of the book, and thank you again for being here. Okay, thank you.
grazie, Presidente Antonelli, and then dear friend Massimo. We've known Massimo for close to 40 years. We are lucky, fortunate to live in this world because we have great statesmen, world citizen, and a scholar like Massimo, and politician as well for Italy. Thank you so much. I'm extremely honored to have this opportunity as a way to as a payback to the honor that the Academy has given to me. Quickly, just one note on what Massimo said about the one-child policy, the role I played. We were both trained as demographers. My work in that area, I mainly consider that comparing myself to a seismologist and then to a meteorologist. That is the people who forecast weather and then study earthquakes. As demographers, we know when the population was still growing, but it could decline by someday. And that's how I engaged in that activity out of a conscience, but also as a duty as a social scientist. I think that's a very important note I want to add. I'm so delighted to just have left the, what do we call, the Lezioni di Guerra, and then to this Città Eterna. So the world is really, at this moment, in a state of wars, trade wars, and so it's great to be here in Rome, to be away from the noises in the United States. But this actually is very relevant to the topic here, even though today I was not planning to talk about US-China trade relations or that part. The book, I'll use just a little 25 minutes or so to summarize this, to open the discussion. The book was on the last 40 years of this great era in world history, and it was called the China's economy, this transformation boom. We would not be in this situation of trade wars had there not been this growth. And that is China's share of the global economic output. 40 years ago, 45 years ago, China had less than 2.5% of world's economic output measured by the GDP. And even by 2000, China only had less than 4%. So the United States would not want to go to war with China when its economy is so little. And also, China would not be able to stand up to fight back with now, for starting less than 20 hours ago, 104% tax rate tariff started to be imposed on Chinese exports. And now China has fought back with 84% tariffs, right? Now, had China been this weak or that weak, China would not be able in the position to fight back as well. So we are unfortunate to be in this crazy era caused by this crazy president of the United States for this world war, trade war. And, but we're lucky that he's fighting with China and China is standing up. You know, you notice on this chart, over the last 40 or 45 years, with China's rise in global economic importance, the importance of the United States, the position of the United States has not weakened. Look at this, right? So US has basically maintained its share of the global economy. So that's very important. What has happened is the share for EU and for Japan has dropped, right? Around this time, 2000, okay, 2004, so slightly after 2000, the Wall Street Journal in the United States gathered 12 Nobel Prize winners in economics, and they had a session to discuss in 75 years, by 2079, that's still many decades from now, which economy would become the largest in the world, the United States, China, or the EU. Okay, this is 12 economists with Nobel Prize in economics, okay. Half of them did not think China was going to be the largest economy by 2079. And this is what happened. So if we look at the measures by purchasing power parity, PPP, not with constant dollar, by 10 years ago, by 2014, China actually already exceeded the United States as the largest economy. What I want to say this is that even though I think many people are bought into this idea that China's rise was inevitable, it was a surprise, not only to the Nobel Prize, Economics Prize winners, but also to Chinese leaders. I write about this in my book, which I would not spend time to talk about this. So I want to say a few words about why I wrote this book. In the preface, I listed 2 occasions. One is coming back from visiting Massimo and Gustav and others at the University of Florence in 2019, right before the pandemic. This is when China was already, economically was already ascended. And also earlier in 2017, I spent several months visiting University of Padua. Here I have dear friends, Gianpiero and Maria coming here. And those visits brought me back in history to look at China in a much larger global perspective, not just focusing on what China did in the last 40 years, but look at world history. Larry Summers, who was the Treasury Secretary in the United States and also the president of Harvard, made a comparison saying that in the last millennia, 1,000 years, there are 3 events that transformed the world history. And those were the Italian Renaissance, where Massimo protects, and the Industrial Revolution, and then the rise of China. So I thought I could think about China also in the view of Italy in Renaissance, and we'll get back to that at the end. Well, the other was a pandemic. After I returned from Florence, like in 3 months, actually in 2 months, COVID-19 erupted in China, right? So I was not traveling, and then I thought I should use the time wisely. And I was not, the second reason for writing the book is I was not interested or satisfied by these per capita GDP numbers, because for people in the future to look at this great transformation that China had underwent, these numbers would mean nothing or very little, these numerical numbers. So we want to look at how people's lives in China improved. And so for much of the book, I documented the increase in standard of living, and more importantly, I went into exploration on how do we appreciate this era of great economic boom in world history, and then what's coming ahead, right? So given the time that I have here, I will just go through a very few slides. I want to first take you to these four narratives you probably all have seen, one way or the other. That is how unique China is. China is different from other countries, right, in having this growth. And we also hear very much on how China's growth was on cheap labor. And much of the narratives we tend to read are those praising the role of the government. And lastly, how this growth was preordained. People say, oh, we knew this was going to come. And also, it's irreversible. China will continue to have high speed of economic growth and then continue the success. I don't have time to go through all of this. I think what I want to focus is one that is, the first one is how unique or not unique is China's economic boom, and also to look at the future. But before I do that, I want to go back and then to share with you just one chart that I think of all that summarizes the economic growth and an increase in standard of living. That is this one. This is the height of girls, 7-year girls in rural China from 1992 to 2002. In 20 years, the average height of the Chinese girls increased by 8 centimeters. Okay, so this is the best, one of the best indicators of improvement in nutrition. Okay, and how does that compare with world history? At the highest, fastest growth period in Europe, in Japan, and in the United States. This economic historians have studied. The increase per decade is about 2 centimeters. The Chinese pace was twice. So we're talking about 4 centimeters per decade. And especially, I will not go into the gender differentiation because the Chinese girls were the most disadvantaged back before this economic takeoff. Okay. Now, how unique is the Chinese process? First, we look at how the standard of living has increased. Okay, this is all in the book, but not in the chart like this. First, we see this is nutrition. The measure is vegetable oil, cooking oil, how that increased in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And that was due to the shift from collective farming in the people's commune system to household farming. Okay. And then we look at housing. So these are the indicators of appliances inside the urban and the rural households. When people have more food to eat, they started to have better housing, right? And then in the 2000s, we started when they have good housing, clothing, and they started to travel around and with the cars. So that is the automobile increase the pace. And then guess what? Overseas trips. So I think people in Rome, in Firenze, and in Venice must have seen the sudden increase of Chinese tourists replacing the Japanese and Koreans early on. So in terms of how people improve their lives, the Chinese follow the path that other societies experienced in the past. No difference. Now, this is not surprising. Okay, I will pass all this stuff to how is China different from other societies that have undergone industrialization? Between the mid-1980s and 2020, the urban share of the Chinese population increased from about 25%. So China was a largely agrarian society 40 years ago, 80%, 75% of the population were in the countryside engaged in farming. And by now, it's, I think, close to 70%. So this actually ends, I think, 2017, 2018, so close to 70%. So this is the great migration, urbanization, and the labor force transformation from farming to non-farming. And in this process, per capita income in China increased over 11-fold. So this is to be expected when a farmer whose hourly wage cannot even be calculated because people depended on annual yield. You have no hourly income. When that person moves to city to become a bricklayer, or a woman, a girl, become an assembly line worker making iPhones, and the hourly wage increase is tremendous. So this is what happened in China with urbanization, industrialization, and then increase in income. China was not only the country that had undergone this. So this is South Korea, China's neighbor. And South Korea had urbanization, the transformation earlier from the 1960s to the 1990s, and its urban population share increased from 30 to about 80%, and the per capita income increase is even higher than what China experienced. And you have Japan. So China has had its own twists and turns, has its own characteristics for its economic, social, and political systems, but underneath this is a similar process of labor force transformation from farming to non-farming. So this is what has happened in China. Okay, so I want to go quickly to the narratives and talk about some of the materials in the book, and then to get back to where the ideas of the book began. Excuse me, let me first, So China's economy, after growing at over 10% per year, dropped to only 5% last year, right? And I think many people point to the policy choices China has made and for this slowing down, and also have urged the government to take this measure or that measure. I think there's room to talk about the policy options, choices, but fundamentally, if you look at what happens after faster growth, if you look at Japan, look at South Korea, the slowing down of the economic growth is inevitable, right? And look at Japan here. So after it reached the height, the growth rate was like about no more than 1.5% per year. South Korea is better, but it's still less than 3%. So there are what I call the gravitational forces for slowing down in economic growth after the periods of high growth. So in other words, China has entered an era of slow growth dictated by these gravitational forces. If China's economic transformation fundamentally was not that different from what we've seen in Japan, in South Korea, or even the other parts of the world earlier, there's no reason that China would be able to defy these gravitational forces, such as spending on social welfare, right? And in the Chinese case, there are substantial, what I call the headwinds. One is China has, because of its history, has an unfinished urbanization. That is, even though only less than 70%, about 70% of the population are already in the cities, only 50% of them have what's called a local household registration. What that means is that these people are denied, Chinese same citizens, they are denied the same benefits in the place of residence. Now, China would not be able to continue as a justful, fair society if these different identities continue to carry after 4 decades of economic boom. But to close this gap between the middle line and then bottom line, which means it's over 200 million people, to incorporate them into the cities, treating them as the same Chinese citizens, now they look the same now, will be a political and also economic challenge. You have to spend money. You cannot lower the benefits of the current urban population. You have to gradually increase social security, healthcare for the disadvantaged population of rural origins. China faces a demographic free fall in a way. This I have studied and warned about fertility of the one-child policy and then the long-term low fertility. But given China's accelerated aging process, and with the Chinese characteristics, that is over 100 million families with only one child, China faces a tremendous pressure with population aging. And we've done projections on the physical spending just due to healthcare and pension, and with even the current level, without increasing benefit level, China could run out of government spending, could spend all the revenue on these items in 10 years or so. And this is what's interesting, I think I want to point to your attention. This is the economic growth rate, the bottom line. Look at the fastest growth decade for China. Okay, this is before the current government. It's over average 10%. Economic growth rate is 10 points, over 10%. And then the fast growth brought in so much government revenue. The revenue on average was over 20%. So in other words, in the years before I returned to Tsinghua as a professor for 3 years, China had so much money to spend. And that's where the money that came for the airports, the rapid railways, and buildings, and the universities. China expanded its university enrollment by 6-fold in 10 years. So China now has enough space for every birth to go to college. So those 10 years, the government, there was a lot of corruption. That's why the anti-corruption campaign can never end in China, because there was so much money going around at that time. But look at what happened. When the economic growth rate dropped to 5%, the government revenue also, the growth rate also diminished. And now one of the challenges people talk about is what's called the 3 Ds, right? Deflation, demography, and the debt, the local debts in China. So China faces this headwind as well. And then the third one, I would ignore this. China also has turned into one of the most unequal societies in terms of income equality, but most concerning of wealth inequality. Now, the United States has had more than 2 decades of capitalism, and this is the wealth inequality measure. It's 0.8. Now it's probably higher now with the oligarchs. But China, the last time it was measured over 10 years ago, was 0.74. So 1 meaning absolute inequality. So to address inequality is a political challenge as well. China does not have property tax, does not have inheritance tax. So it's still a paradise for capitalists, right? So, but to help with supporting the aging population with social benefits, you have to get taxes from somewhere. But to have property tax is a huge political challenge. It's not easy, right? I will skip this and then to talk about the last slides I want to have here. The book is called China's Age of Abundance. But I want to, finishing the book and then also returning from Italy, I came to the realization that with the abundant material prosperity in China, how little people's minds are allowed to think freely, right? With the economic boom, the country has went back. I think it's very understandable. This idea of control has returned, the fear of instability, the fear of out of control. So the last graph I had here in my book, okay, that's second to the last. The book uses mostly published Chinese statistics, survey results, and the censuses. And this is one that was published in early 1980s, showing the number of books that's printed every year. Even in China, even now, you have to have a number, a proof number, to print the book. You cannot just publish a book by yourself. And then this is the number of pages that people read. So for those who are not expert on Chinese history, so China had a boom in both the number of publications and also the number of per person page read in the mid to late 1950s. And this is before what's called the anti-rightist movement that came right afterwards. This is during Mao's 100 Flowers boom period. So there were books and then criticisms, and look at what happened afterwards, right? So both the number of books and also number per pages read per person dropped during the famine, and then it dropped in terms of number of books, dropped to the lowest in 1966, 67. This is during the period of the Cultural Revolution, so the books are not allowed to be printed. And then here we have, ironically, almost the largest number of pages read per person. So everyone was reading the little red book. Everyone had one. And then preceding the Chinese economic boom, China also had a short period of a renaissance, and that's when you see both the drastic increase in the number of books, especially in just in the few years in the late 1970s after Mao's death, and also what people read. Now, I could go to find similar numbers for the last 10, 20 years, but this would take a lot more time because right now it's not just printed media, it's vast social media. But one thing I can tell you is the current leader of China, the top leader, Xi Jinping, he is a very prolific author. In the last 10 years, he published 100 books. And from elementary school students to college professors, now it's required reading. So China, in that way, is going back to this era that we're seeing fewer books printed. I tried to have this book translated, be published in China, and I was told by two presses that they could not even talk about the urban-rural disparity. That was not a sensitive issue, topic 20, 30 years ago, even 10 years ago, right? So the censorship, both from the government and also self-censorship, people became scared, worried. They don't want to lose what they have. But we want to look at the history that how China get to the current spot. It's because of this, this liberalization of mind, right? So I do want to come back to this one last slide. Can I still do this, Massimo? Yes, okay. That is to say how lucky we are, and also Chinese people, China is at the current stage. So one way I summarize this book on this part of Chinese history is called One People. That is the vast population in the rural areas. They took lives in their own hands, okay, and they transformed China. The three things that are most meaningful for changing people's lives: food to eat, diet, okay, clothes to wear, export, and then houses to live, okay. These were household responsibility system in the countryside, farming, rural industries in the 1990s, I wrote about this, and migration to cities, migrant labors. Guess what's the common feature of these three most important transformations? None of them was initiated by the government. Okay, so the government embraced this, okay, and there are wonderful things that have been done, building up the institutions, doing reforms, but think of the most important forces that changed China. They share this one feature, so that's one people, right? And it's not repeatable. We cannot have this migration, urbanization, this cheap labor again. And the other one is a devastation. So we try to get what's called the silver lining out of these disasters. Hopefully we'll have the same thing right now, is the 10 years of the Cultural Revolution that the Chinese people suffered. It was a political and also economic catastrophe, but without the Cultural Revolution, the third person, who is Deng Xiaoping, who led China, so it's one people, one history, one person. Deng Xiaoping said this, he said without the Cultural Revolution, even he could not have convinced the Chinese people to go totally to a capitalist road, right? But China has been very lucky, not because of the Cultural Revolution, but because of many other factors. I want to get one and then finish. That is, in 1989, following inflation and corruption sensed by the Chinese public, millions of people in China turned out to protests, to express their anxieties, and then the protests ended with a bloody crackdown in the very center of Beijing, in Tiananmen Square, with tanks rolling in, right? So people saw that. And so China's fate of economic reform was at stake in 1989. In 1992, Deng Xiaoping was 87 years old, almost not as old as, he's not as energetic as Massimo, but he made a tour to South China, insisting that China would have to go on the reform route. He even threatened to dismiss the leader in Beijing in 1992. Just imagine Deng Xiaoping was too weak, was not interested, or did not make this trip. Would we expect China to be in the same position today? Also, Deng Xiaoping basically personally anointed 2 generations of Chinese leaders. So from his immediate successor, Jiang Zemin, Zhu Rongji, to Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, there were no political infights for the top positions, and that was not the case in 2012, 2013. right? So imagine those things were not done. Imagine China did not enter WTO in 2001. This would not have happened. So China is very lucky because of its people, because of leaders like Deng Xiaoping, and because of the great historical opportunities, including the last 20, 30 years of building up China and also making China a global economic power. So to come back to this very depressing time of today, so we have to, I think, we have to celebrate the drastic improvements in standard of living for 1/5 of humanity. Have to appreciate this. This changed the face of the world. And then also change the world politics. So it's for us to see, now we're at another historical juncture, because history is really a lot of these junctures. So let's see how this new China, with its economic and political power, can not only protect and help its own population, but also the whole world. Let me just end there, and thank you for listening to this.
Thank you very much, Wang Feng, for your extremely interesting lecture. I think we are all admired of the progress that China has made. 25 years ago, your book said China one quarter of mankind, of humanity. But at the end of this century, if we look at the UN projections, China will have maybe not 1/4, but maybe 1/10 of the world population. So it's a big change, a big revolution that is going to take place in the next coming decades. And
there is a chart.
Sorry?
There is a chart, but I can tell you, we are underestimating how fast this demographic change that's unfolding in China. From 1/4 to 1/7. Okay, 2020, the UN projection with China by the end of this century would have 1/7 of the humanity. But 2 years after that projection, the UN came out with a new set of projections. China's population by the end of the century could only be 1/10. Yeah. The size would be halved, and with a lot of elder people.
Personally, I don't believe very much in projections that far. But anyhow, this gives an idea of the enormous changes that are going to take place in geopolitics, world geodemography, as I would call it. Well, now we are going to have three comments, three interventions, and the first will be by Professor Ignazio Musu, who is an economist, is a member of this academy. He's an emeritus professor at the University of Venice, and he's a mathematician, expert in environment, and also an expert in China. He's a multidisciplinary scholar. So Ignazio, you have the floor, and you give your...
Check the time, because...
I will signal to you and don't worry. We have
Thank you very much, Professor Wang Feng, for this book. I found it, I read it with great interest. I am an economist, so I am not very deep in sociological issues, but I found a number of points that I want to now just, I hope, briefly mention. And the first point is the first chapter. The first chapter of the book, the title is Surprise. And surprise for what? You mentioned it in your presentation of today. Because of the way economists have analyzed what the book changes, the ascendance of China to the age of abundance. The Economist, many Nobel Prizes, as you mentioned, has insisted basically merely on passing from a planet to a market economy. What you, on the contrary, and this is one of the points that impressed me very much in your second chapter, is how strongly social factors have worked in explaining how China ascended to the age of abundance. At the end of the Maoism, in the book, we read that 80% of the population was living in rural areas. But this 80% of population, they were very poor, but they had a good level of education. 90% of 15 to 19 years old had basic education, and they had a good level of health. Since 1952, I read in the book, life expectation increased from 32 to 69 years from 1952 to the end of the Maoism. So there was a population prepared to the reform. And the greatness of Deng Xiaoping, as you mentioned, was precisely this. He understood that that population only needed the opportunities to express what their cultural level and health level allowed. And this is why they started industrialization not from the urban areas, but from the rural areas. This is a typical process in China. The economic reforms in China, they started from the rural areas. It was in the rural areas that peasants became small entrepreneurs. The idea of the town, the town and village enterprises, small firms in manufacture. The industrialization of the urban areas came later. And this is crucial, and I read very few books on this point. This is the first book I read very deeply interested in this, dealing with this issue. Then the book has all the analysis of the changes of the pattern of consumption, and you have explained in many slides earlier on. I would only mention the importance in the consumption patterns of the change in the way the Chinese population entered into the digital area. In the digital area, we know that now half of the world mobile payments are settled in China. In urban areas, 90% of the residents use only mobile payments. Many sellers, they do not accept any other form of payment, and an increasing person does not use even ATM machines. And this is a revolution in the way consumption has developed. Another point in the book which mentioned to be remembered here is the way in which you analyze the industrialization of urban areas. Because the industrialization of urban areas in China was distorted. It was distorted by the system you mentioned before, the Youkou system. You couldn't in China benefit, the migrant from rural areas to the cities could not benefit of social services such as house, education, health support, social security, unless they didn't have the Youkou, the permit to become from rural to urban. And this system is changing, but this changes very slowly. It has been changing in small cities, but not in large cities. Why? Because the governments of larger cities, they do not have money enough to support the change, so they resist the change. And this is one of the reasons why, when you arrive at the point, what can we do to stop the descendants from the abundance? you write that we cannot rely on urbanization, and this is one of the reasons, because with this system you cannot rely on continuing urbanization. There is also the crisis in the property levels of the housing markets, which has not been solved. And then there is the last part of the book on which I would say something. You analyze the reasons why China has been changing. In one of your graphics, clearly the point where the rate of growth of China was high was 2007. After the economic crisis, the rate of growth of China started to decline, even if the Chinese government spent a lot of money with indebtedness in investment to react to the global economic crisis. But then the rate of growth is declining. So this is a fact. China now is trying to keep 5%. They will achieve it in 2015. But then you have another unexpected outcome, the increase in young unemployment, which was in 2023, 1/5 of the 16-24 youngster was looking for a job. This is new in a situation. This is something new. And then the point which you explore with more deepness in your book is the decline in population and increase in population age. Well, there is no time to insist, but there is one point I would ask you to say something. I read many times recently that in China, we know why the retrieval of the one China policy didn't work. Because young people in China don't want to have more children. And why they don't want to have more children, like in our Western countries? One of the reasons is a reaction which we read. The Chinese call it tang ping. It means lying flat in English. So these young people in the social media, they react against education and against work. And this is one of the problems that the present leadership of China has to deal with. It is one of the reasons why younger do not want to have children. So it's a serious problem. But then there is the other point which you mention when you talk about there is a point in your book I want to cite because I was very impressed. You analyze what you call aging and welfare expansion scenario in your book. And you estimate that if China would elevate the 2030 benefits in education, health, and pension to the average level of the OECD countries, the average level in 2009, not now, in 2009, with no further, this is the point, with no further increase in the share of GDP devoted to government revenue. In this case, public expenditure in the three sectors, education, health, and pensions, would rise in 2030 to 2/3 of the general government revenue, which is rather impressive, because what does it mean? It means that China should not spend any more in, for example, developing technological progress, which is one of the issues they have now. To face, for example, they are delaying semiconductors. And they are doing a lot now in this field. We all read about this new artificial intelligence revolution of DeepSeek, which it's less costly than some artificial intelligence found in the United States. But the point is it possible to imagine that, and you stress this point in your book, is it possible to imagine that the share of government revenue over the GDP will remain constant? You mentioned that in your presentation, and no, you should increase taxes, which is extremely difficult in any countries, but also in China. I recently read that reacting to the initiative of President Trump in terms of tariffs. China, for me unexpected, is now reacted by responding to this initiative. They don't want to react to the value of the exchange rate for the moment. That we don't know what's going to happen. But what I read, that the Chinese officials have said, we are prepared, we have ample room to expand the state's fiscal deficit. According to you, is it true, or is it just a declaration? Because if it is true, it is not enough to expand the fiscal deficit. In China, you should expand the fiscal deficit by improving efficiency in public sector. And this is the point you touch in the aftermath of your book, when, according to what I've been reading, you are a bit pessimistic about the possibility of the present leadership to enter into this area of improving efficiency because of the state-owned company still suffers of inefficiency. The political power still is too much concerned with its own stability. And I would be very interested in knowing what you think about that, because I tend to be a bit more optimistic, because if we are not a bit more optimistic, it's very worrying for the global international situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ignazio. I think that maybe Wang Feng will want to reply and clarify some points that you have raised. And now we are going to Patrizia Farina. Patrizia Farina, she's a professor at the University of Demography in Milan, at the Bicocca. And she will look at China. She knows Chinese, after all. She's an expert of China. Although she doesn't want now to work on China, she works mainly on Africa. And, but she has a lot of experience on China society and China population. Her doctoral thesis was on the fertility of Chinese fertility according to the census of 1991, 92. And well, she is an expert particularly on topics of sexual and reproductive health, on migration, trafficking, or human trafficking, and forced prostitution, and particularly in all aspects of attaining to the individual human rights, and particularly in the population of women in the developing countries, and now in the last few years, particularly on Africa, working on Africa. So you have the floor, and you have 15 to 20 minutes.
Yes, you stop me if needed. Thank you. It is truly an honor being here today, and thank you all very much for your for inviting me to the presentation of the book, a book that inspired me, looking at how several changes you describe very well in the book affect women. In particular women, because we have an inequality in a lot of sense you described, but what I'm saying now is specifically affect women. So, but I don't have any a question about these issues. I prefer to tell you some complementary history of China's contemporary China, looking at the women empowerment, and so I would like to have your opinion and suggestion about it. I start from very far away, but I very fast will come to the contemporary. Why I go very far away? Because from 1950, the Chinese government has been working toward establishing legal equality between men and women. The first very important law was the marriage law, and then after that, the constitution that includes some rights for women and men. In that period, in that decades before the reforms, two key features are evident. First, the emancipation that government look at has been identified as the masculinization of women. There has to be like men for the emancipation. That now we can't accept it, but it was. Still, but the legislation that came out into force often reiterates conventional gender roles, increasing women's reproductive and familial responsibilities. So there is a conflict between what you have to be as men for working purposes and the responsibility of duty in the family. During the period referred as the Iron Bowl, women were encouraged to participate actively in the workforce, and even in less advanced and less profitable sectors. The expectation was they would achieve equality through wages and professional training that mirrored that of their male counterparts. As Deng Xiaoping rose to power, so I come to at the beginning of 80, economic reforms began and everything changed for women and men also, but especially for women. I'll try to say something about this. Less productive activities and associated social service were broken down, and the responsibility for social reproduction fell primarily on families again. Wives and mothers were expected to support the well-being and success of family members and thereby the society. This expectation increased the conflict between caregiving roles and participation in the new labor market, very competitive, which was, how they say, men-oriented because they were better educated than female and more flexible regarding work hours and family duties. The unequal competition often relegated women to lower paying and precarious or less profitable sectors of the job market, increasing income disparities between women and men. To be clear, I'm not denying the economic result of that China witnessed from 80 and that you described very well. But let's consider the left behind population, so-called left behind. I use this term both geographically, from rural, very, very poor rural area, or even in terms of exclusion from development opportunities. There is a double left behind population. We find that more women than men. If you look at behind population, we find that more women than men experience deprivation. Particularly older rural women without networks and weak agency. Or, as you wrote, they continue to shoulder the responsibility for farming and caring for other family members. This is in your book. Additionally, the extensive migration from rural area to urban provided young women with the opportunity, you said, to flee their patriarchal homes and allowing them to seek economic independence and social freedom. Yes, that is true. But however, most find precarious, low-paying job in domestic care, service sector, or as maiden workers in factories. Female migrants face not only the common deprivation common to men, experienced by all migrants, but also increased risks related to violence and sexual and reproductive rights. So from this point of view, we can say that socialist market economy impact both men and women. Yet the opportunities during this age of abundance are not equal, available for all, not so much for women. Women often encounter barriers in the labor market, face more significant challenges due to deregulation. Some scholars call it the feminization of poverty, if you know, and are confronted with gender roles rooted in an increasingly competitive society. The second and last aspect of interest concerns population policies and their effect. In my opinion, China's birth control program has exhibited significant hostility towards women. After at least a decade of success with the One Xiao policy, which aimed to lower the unmet need for contraception in the 60s and 70, for the right, the one-child policy introduced in the early 80s marked a new era. This policy has profound and lasting effects on society, limiting women's autonomy and self-determination of reproductive rights, while giving them the responsibility at the same time, the responsibilities for meeting national economic goals through the reduction of births. The one-child policy has led a resurgence, of discrimination against women. It is also in the book, as we can see clearly, by sex selection abortion to prevent the birth of the only female child. This consider it is very is terrible because these conditions has forced women into a complicity with patriarchal values, reinforcing the social preferences for male children. In essence, by acting as agent of the family that favors males, women perpetuate their inferiority within society. Only a minority of them escape from these restrictions, such as refusing to pay fines, adopting daughters, temporarily relocating to give birth, removing IUD, and so on. But it was a very dark period, according to me. And after abandoning the one-child policy in 2015, the government urged families to have 2 and then even 3 children to address the aging population. Yet, a decade later, the total fertility rate is not increasing, nor is the number of births, even less. The lack of results in addressing the issues is partly due to structural obstacles. The significant financial burden of raising children in China today, and motherhood and balancing the work and motherhood remain poorly addressed from Chinese government until now, at least until now, particularly when family responsibility are not shared. I'm not discussing now these issues because it is common to Italy, to a lot of countries. But instead I wish to highlight 2 specific aspects of this period, and I would like to know if you agree. The first aspect revolves around the naturalization of male and female roles nowadays. In today's consumer society, we are witnesses in extreme feminine representation of women, emphasizing ideals of beauty and motherhood. This starkly contrasts with the androgynous image that featured in previous decades. I remember the Iron Girls, for example, have been eclipsed by women who embody celebrated beauty, traits. This portrait of the female body aligns with society assumption about their natural roles, reinforcing a sense of harmony within the family and by extension in society. Because family and society in China, I don't know if you agree, are very, very often put together. Okay. For sure, legitimizing traditional roles does not undermine women's rights. But now the discourse about women's rights is about self-esteem, self-confidence, independence, not the promotion of real gender equality. Let me say that the emphasis of natural roles that come in these years and family dynamics often shift the discourse surrounding women back into a Confucian theoretical framework. And in 2015 interview, Jian Qin, an eminent scholar of Confucianism, summarized the doctrine's cultural roots very well. He has said it, among others, for Chinese women, participation in public life is not an essential requirement. It doesn't form the basis of their sense of fulfillment and belonging. Being a career woman does not define the value of a woman, and professional success is only meaningful if it is not against the traditional roles of daughter, wife, and mother. I'm not saying that Chinese government is adopting this perspective, but does not fully adopt this radical stance, but recognize the significance of revitalizing traditional values. Xi Jinping in 2014 declared we must pay attention to tradition in the formation of families and promote a new culture of marriage and reproduction. Here, all the declining total fertility rate is the real problem of this. And in a speech to the All China Women Federation Congress in 2023, he states, we must actively cultivate a new culture of marriage and childbirth, reinforce young people's views on marriage, parenthood, and family, and promote policy to support childbirth. The last thing that I want to say, to underline is that the transition from a birth control to one encouraged childbirth has highlighted tension, a lot of tension among social expectations, economic pressures, and reproductive rights. The social climate surrounding reproduction is well shaped by the aggressive revival of the leftover women campaigns that started in 2007 and again is a new revival of the campaign, which stigmatizes educated urban women and for being single or childless. Media portrays reinforced by the All China Women's Federation often label women after older than 27 years old as overly demanding, materialistic, independent, disruptive women because they fail to meet traditional standards of femininity and challenge the perceived natural order of reproductive roles. China has made significant progress in advancing women's rights, as demonstrated by, for example, the protection of women's rights interest law in 1992, or the 2016 law that addressed violence against women. However, references to the Confucian tradition persist in many legal or political texts, emphasizing that family harmony is the foundation of the family and society, and that is the model. The 2016 law in my opinion, is really emblematic. Family harmony and social stability are included in the first article of the law, but it can be misleading since the primary aim should focus on protecting victims, not over maintaining the marital union. And so the last question, I think that two subjects persist in the contemporary history of China: the emancipation of women and demographic policy. Both are shaped by national objectives that often overlook the effect on women empowerment. It emerged in the call for women to return home during the economic crisis along the contemporary history. The first one was, I cited this because it is very representative. The first was during the crisis in 1956, Mao Zedong wrote on Remigio Pao, participation in agricultural production is rural women innate right and duty. Making and raising children, as well as managing the household, are also responsibilities of rural women. This distinction is what sets women apart from men. It was Mao Zedong in 1956. After reading the book, I wonder if encouraging women to focus on family, or softly, but not so softly, asking them to return home, may relieve China's increasing economic challenges, the challenges that next to the age of abundance. Or in other words, is the government still asking women to act in the country's interest before they own? And also, even China's eco-demographic policy, from ban of abortion and contraception in the 50s, and then with the one-child policy, until the current challenge aimed at promoting larger families, I believe that reflect, and I would like to have your opinion, reflect a complex interplay of countries' need and reproductive rights, with outcomes that, in my opinion, too often are not in favor of women. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrizia. You shed light on an aspect that is sometimes neglected in our discussions. Now I am glad to ask Axel Berkowski, who is a professor at the Faculty of Political Science in Pavia and head of a department of ISPI, the Institute of International Political Studies of Milan. And I mentioned the last book, China, GDR Relations from 1949 to 1989.
Yes.
Okay. And well, Axel is an expert of the history of China and Japan and international relations, particularly in East Asia. You have the floor, Axel.
Thank you, Massimo. And of course, intanto grazie mille per l'invito dell'Accademia al Presidente. Non c'è più. Di là. Comunque grazie mille per l'invito, molto lieto, molto contento di essere qua e avere l'opportunità di commentare sul libro. Io avevo l'intenzione di essere molto critico, siccome lui mi ha regalato il libro con una dedica, ho voluto cambiare discorso. No, è un libro fatto molto bene, poi magari continuo in inglese adesso. Also very happy to meet Patrizia Farina here, with whom we have done a book project in the past together. She wrote a chapter in our book on China. It was maybe it was the best chapter of the book right after my own chapter. Yeah. No, but appreciate this, and she's really Italy's, top China demographer, and and also internationally very acknowledged. And so is Professor Wang, of course, who has produced a very good book I have read with great interest. I am a political scientist and have turned into a historian in Pavia. So some of my comments will be different from the comments before. I've got a couple of comments, a couple of questions I would like to address to Professor Wang. But, you know, not before, again, saying this is a really, really good book. If you want to know something about, in detail, on China's economic history, in the post-Mao era, in Deng Xiaoping's reform area, this is the book to consult. So, you know, compliments again for this book. I really enjoyed reading this. I did not understand everything, okay, but that's, you know, but that's really my own fault because I come from a different discipline. But, you know, for those who are interested in learning more on what we have seen today, this is certainly, you know, a very, very good book to consult. Couple of questions, couple of comments on, as promised. You know, Professor Wang is calling China at the beginning, you know, a preeminent political power. Yes, of course, China is an economic power. China's economy is roughly $18 trillion big, you know, as compared to the US, roughly $26 trillion big, so the world's second biggest economy. Aspetta minimo. Okay, I wait a little bit because a little bit, nice people. Okay, so it's a big economy, of course, the world's second biggest economy. When we talk about China as a political global power, I would have my doubts about this. China is certainly, you know, an important player, but it's a latecomer to international relations. You know, China, of course, and of course we read about this also in the book, has lost an entire generation, you know, of policymakers and academics and other thinkers during the Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution, of course, you're all very, you know, familiar with this. You know, the impact of the Cultural Revolution was devastating, obviously, you know, on Chinese society, on Chinese everything, basically. And this also had an impact also on the sort of experience China, you know, could not have gained, you know, in the 1960s and 1970s, you know, in international diplomacy, international politics. And I sometimes still have, when I interact with Chinese politicians, Chinese academics not so much, but Chinese politicians, Chinese policymakers, you know, I sometimes have the feeling, and I would like to have your comment on this, or at least when I was still doing this, I don't interact so much anymore due to reasons that we might want to talk about later. I had the feeling that they are still, you know, due to the lack of experience, due to the impact, the negative impact, and due to this lost generation being stuck in, you know, sort of a Cold War rhetoric when I talk to them. You know, they have the feeling that the step towards, you know, modern, you know, diplomatic lingo has not been made yet. So China is, as far as I'm concerned, and without any offense, is a latecomer to international relations, which in turn, I would argue, is also you know, putting China's credibility and China's weight as a political power in doubt. And I have to say, and again, with all due respect to the Chinese people here in the room, sometimes I have the feeling also the policies made over the last years, especially the policy adopted by the current government during the pandemic, you know, is a reflection of this. You know, a bit clumsy, you know, not knowing what to do, and then the outcome is then, you know, radical policies which do not respond or which did not respond to what China needed during that period. So I'd like to hear that on your opinion on this, which is of course not directly related to your book, but of course you are very familiar with this. Age of abundance, yes, of course. Sure, you know, China's a big economy. GDP per capita in China is roughly what now, $15,000. But that's from $15,000, you know, to $25,000 or to $30,000 or 30,000 euros is still a long way. So China is, at least so it seems, but I stand to be corrected, is stuck in the so-called middle income trap, you know, la trappola del medio reddito, no? The middle income trap, you know, is China ever going to be, you know, able, or when is China ever going to be, you know, to take the next step, you know, to become like Japan, for example. Japan, you know, of course, became rich before it came old. In China, of course, it seems to be the very opposite. China is becoming very old before coming, you know, rich enough to you know, allow itself to be sitting on this. So, you know, the middle income trap, $15,000 per head, you know, not in PPP terms, of course, that would be much higher, but when is China going to, you know, to make the next step, you know, and do you think this is foreseeable? Of course, we don't like projections because they turn out to be very wrong, but do you think we can dare a projection on on and when and if, whether, China will be able to take the next step, towards a highly industrialized country with a GDP per capita, surpassing 15,000, like Taiwan, for example, 32,000, when is this going to take place? I have my doubts about this because there's a lot of talk about the China peak. China has reached its potential. China will never, according to these arguments, and there's certainly also room for debate, China will never overcome the US. Will never be as big as the US. Also because, and that's another discourse, and there's lots of arguments about this and lots of debate on this, that the actual size of the Chinese economy is not $18 trillion, but could be up to 1/3 smaller. There's a lot of discourse on this. And if we put this into numbers. Let's say the US economy is $26 trillion big. Let's say the Chinese economy is 18 minus 1/3. That's only 12. That would mean, if that is accurate, that would mean that the size of the Chinese economy today is only 50% of the size of the US economy today. Okay, so there's certainly something to think about. If the statistics, if the figures, including the growth figures, are accurate, then of course the size of the Chinese economy is much bigger than only 50% of the size of the economy. Of the US economy. The side effects, of course, you write about the side effects, and Patrizia also mentioned the side effects of rapid economic growth, social inequalities. Of course, China is, the Gini coefficient is less favorable than the one in the US. So China is, at least on paper, the last time I checked, is more unequal than US society. Pressure on Chinese society to perform, turning into a sexless society, just like Japan is turning into a sexless society, with all the repercussions. Censorship, political oppression, all of these side effects that have been accompanied by China's rapid economic growth. And then you talk about, rightly of course, you talk about material prosperity. You mentioned this term material prosperity a number of times in the book, rightfully so, because China has made a giant leap forward in terms of material prosperity. But what about the rest? What about the negative repercussions? Of course, you mentioned them in the book, and we have mentioned them today. Do you think that the Chinese people, how can I put this diplomatically? That the Chinese people are prepared to put up with this sort of pressure forever, for the benefit of material and economic prosperity? Or do you think there is at some point going to be, like it happened in Japan when the Japanese people said, look, we have worked, very, very hard. Now we want to take advantage of our material benefits and work a little bit less. Is this something that you could see in China after decades? And you're right, of course, it is, economic growth triggered and triggered by above all the rural population. But is there, enough, pressure within Chinese society to want Chinese people, more than just material prosperity? I'm not talking about democracy or anything like this, because that would be too controversial, maybe for this, for today, and I don't want to go into this. But is there enough pressure already, in the offing to might convince Chinese people that there's more beyond material prosperity? You talk about the transformation from a socialist economy to a market-based economy. Absolutely. But when we look at what is going on in China today, right now, today, it is. I have the feeling this is, and you alluded to this also in your presentation, it's really, a giant leap backwards. What is happening in China today? State-owned companies, so companies owned by the Communist Party, if you will, or by the Chinese state, are buying private companies on a massive scale. Okay, so the idea of renationalizing the Chinese economy is very, very prominent. If you look at the figures, okay, sure, we have lots of, we have millions of private companies in China, and they will not be absorbed by the state. But we have very important, very innovative, millions of start-up companies which are being bought up by state-owned companies. Sure, state-owned companies are not stupid. They say, well, there's a lot of innovative capital. This is very good, but this is not the way it should be happening in a market, in a truly market-based economy. The state is not there to buy up, private companies. Look at the figures. Look at the statistics. If you don't believe me, I'm not making this up. But these acquisitions of of private companies by big state-owned companies is massive, and in my view, it's going into the wrong direction. I'd like to hear your opinion on this. I'm halfway through, a couple of more minutes, if I may. Deng Xiaoping. I mean, you like Deng Xiaoping very, very much. You know, of course, he is the architect of China's economic and economic and structural reforms. No doubt about this. Without Deng Xiaoping or somebody like him, you know, China would not have pulled it off. Very, 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 very clear. He's to be admired for this. However, as a political scientist and a historian, I have, and I'm not going into details because it's not part of your book, and that's not the objective of your book. But if you look at Deng Xiaoping's political legacy, you know, and what he has done or what he has not done during the 1980s, you know, allowing, you know, free speech, allowing, you know, calls, you know, urgent calls, various calls for you know, democracy, you know, political plurality. His legacy is, of course, less, you know, glorious, you know. He's always been remembered, you know, everywhere and by everybody, you know, for his economic and structural reforms, but his political legacy of the 1980s, culminating in Tiananmen 1989. Let's not forget that Deng Xiaoping gave Li Peng, the prime minister, to order to end, you know, demonstrations on Tiananmen Square and elsewhere in China with force. You know, that's also part of his legacy. It's not part of your book, but I would like to remind the audience that you know, if you're interested in reading, you know, not from me, but if you're interested in reading more about Deng Xiaoping's political legacy, I think this is noteworthy also to put things into perspective. The big reformer, the big innovator, but also the person responsible for what did not take place in China in the 1980s. Okay, of course debatable, but certainly as a historian, I wanted to point this out. To be sure, China is of course, you know, due to its one-child policy and two-child policy, you know, as you say, rightfully say, in a demographic freefall. And again, like I said earlier, China is in danger, certainly, and this is, you know, me repeating what I've read, written by other, you know, or by demographers. China is very, very likely, and I would like to hear your opinion on this, how likely that is. China is going to be becoming old before it becomes rich, so it will not repeat the experience of Japan and of course South Korea, and to extent also of Taiwan. You talked about debt. You didn't put any figures to this, but I think, and of course you know all the figures much better than I do, but the combined Chinese debt, you know, and I would like the audience to appreciate this, the combined Chinese debt, so corporate, private, public, could be roughly up to 400% of China's GDP, okay? And let's say, for the sake of the argument now, because it serves my argument, let's say, you know, the Chinese economy is $18 trillion big, okay? Then you have a combined debt of $72 trillion, which is roughly, you know, 35 times the Italian economy, okay, basically. So there's an enormous amount of debt, and it's not getting any smaller, okay? And of course, a lot has to do with the provinces. Do you think that this public debt, if my figure corresponds, you know, with anything that's accurate, or whether you think it's smaller, but do you think this is having, you know, will be having a significant impact on, you know, when and if and whether the age of abundance in China will come to an end because of, you know, the pressure coming from debt? Okay, good. Excellent. Yeah, I said this about the Chinese economy. Chinese growth rates, yes, of course. You know, the target, the official target in China is 5%. And by you know, miraculously, over the last couple of years, you know, China always achieved 5% economic growth. I'm not an economist, but I'm not too naive, or I'm not naive enough to believe that the Chinese economy has been growing by 5% over the last 5 years until it dropped from 10%. There's a lot of debate on this, a lot of economists, and I would like to hear your opinion on this, saying that this is, you know, virtually impossible. Okay, China has been growing, you know, for a long time at, you know, at enormous speed, but the only reason why China has been growing by 5% over the last 4 to 5 years is because the Communist Party ordered, you know, the economy to grow by 5% over the last 4 years. Whereas in reality, economic growth rates could be, I stand to be corrected, could be much lower. Okay, there are pockets of growth, of course, you know, in southern China, but no way economists are telling me that China is still growing by 5% per year, which of course would then also put in doubt, the actual overall figure of the Chinese economy amounting to 18 trillion, which could be 1/3 lower due to the fact that the statistics are quite simply inaccurate, at least in China. Chinese youth unemployment, again, something to appreciate, something to be aware of, something to be alarmed about. When it turned out, when 2 years ago, roughly, The Economist, published a big article about Chinese youth unemployment, stating that, unemployment, in China between 19 and 40 is more than 20%, The Chinese government, the Chinese censors, took the statistics off the internet right away, saying, this is unverified and we need to look more into this. And ever since, we don't have the official figures. We don't have the official figures of Chinese youth unemployment. I wonder why. I wonder, maybe, the Chinese government is in the process of verifying this, let's give them the benefit of the doubt, or it is different. It is really that youth unemployment is very, very high and really, is corresponding to the figure of 20 to 22% in China. But it was, of course, conspicuous and, of course, suspicious that, when this article came out and more reports on, growing Chinese youth unemployment, that the Chinese censors or the Chinese state decided to take those statistics off the internet. A few words, one more minute, if I may, then I keep my mouth shut for the rest of the evening. You mentioned, and I think not everybody in the audience knows what you talked about. If I may, I add this. You spoke about the 100 Flowers campaign in China. Mao Zedong's invitation extended to Chinese intellectuals, scholars, intellectuals like yourself, to openly criticize the Communist Party. Okay, let 100 flowers bloom. 100 flowers of Chinese democracy. The Chinese, have the right now, or have the authority, have the right or the privilege to criticize the Communist Party. But not the kind of criticism that actually, turned out or actually evolved during the 100 Flowers campaign. 100 Flowers campaign, of course, that then led to a massive crackdown, executions, torture, and arrest of Chinese intellectuals in charge by, also executed by and supervised by none other than Deng Xiaoping. Putting also, this maybe part of his dark chapter. And then, it was followed by the so-called anti-rightist campaign. I don't know what that means. Nobody knows what an anti-rightist campaign means. It was portrayed as a campaign against, Chinese capitalist, Chinese bourgeoisie. There was no Chinese bourgeoisie in 1957, and there were no Chinese capitalists in 1997. So I don't know what anti-rightist campaign mean. Maybe it's also something lost in translation. But absolutely, Chinese. The 100 Flowers campaign and the anti-rightist movement that followed. Maybe you want to, put some contents also, explaining to me as a non-Chinese, what the anti-rightist element of that campaign was. Of course, that's not your fault. It's not your term. It's Mao Zedong's turn. Last but not least, the rural population. You said the rural population, of course, did the lion's share of dragging China out of economic misery. Absolutely, no doubt about this. But of course, with lots of repercussions, negative consequences. You talk about the migrant workers. Again, to be appreciated, 250 million migrant workers. Maybe the army is a little bit smaller now, but over the decades, 250 million workers moving from the countryside into the cities without any health insurance, without any coverage, because of the Hoko system, So those workers were not only cheap workers, or are, because they still exist, cheap workers, but have any sort of insurance, have no right to ask for permanent residence in the big cities because of the of the residence system still in place. There has been talk about abolishing the system, has never really taken place because it's too convenient. The cheap labor is still being needed. Is this system going to go away? Is China waking up to the reality that it cannot go indefinitely go on, producing economic growth on the shoulders of migrant workers? So much from me. Thank you very much again, and then compliments again for the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Axel. You have posed a lot of questions, and we don't have very much time left, I think maybe 20 minutes. And what I would suggest is that if there are few questions from the floor, we hear the questions and then maybe Wang Feng will give a response, a general response, because answering all the questions is difficult. The number of questions is proportional to the size of China and to the size of our curiosity for a country that is little known, although it's extremely interesting, but the Italian public is not very well informed about what's going on in China. So I think we are looking forward to your next book that must be of about 10,000 pages if you want to answer all the questions that have been raised.
We need 10,000 Marco Polos. We need to send them to China.
So let's see if there are questions from the floor. And then I will give the floor to Wang Feng. Any further curiosity?
Good evening. I'm Giorgio Cuzzelli, University Lincei in Rome. Thank you very much, Professor, for this very interesting conversation, and thanks also for the other very interesting contribution. My question touches upon the availability of budget. As you said, the budget is going to be reduced because of the increased expenditure in health, education, and pensions. Therefore, where does the defense investment go at this point? China is on the rampage as much as defense policy and armaments and the contest with the United States is at stake in the South China Sea, around Taiwan, etc., etc. Where does the defense money go then? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Some other questions from the floor? Yes, Roberto, Professor Scazzieri.
Yes, thank you. You mentioned at some point the Industrial Revolution of the early 19th century. Well, of course, this first Industrial Revolution, and I think that's something that it's a recognized result in economic history, was preceded by an agricultural revolution, which triggered a kind of virtuous circle between the agricultural sector and the industrial sector. I was just asking you if you could tell us whether you think there was a similarly strong agricultural revolution with a similar increase in agricultural productivity in China during this phase of industrialization and urbanization. Of course, if there has not been that, assuming that the relationship between agriculture and industry became more a global relationship through international trade, how this could be affected by a disruption in the international trade relationships. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Roberto. If there are no further questions, I would like to give the floor to Wang Feng. Of course, you are not. We are not asking you to answer in detail all the questions, the many questions that have been raised, but give us a sense of what your opinion is on the major issues.
Well, first of all, thanks to the panelists for their insightful comments and the discussions. And when I came to Rome, what's in my mind was not just talk about the book, but a occasion at this academy to talk about China. So I think I'm so honored to have all of you and I have the audience to be here. I was thinking for Axel's question, what's the standard of living in China really? We should really send more Marco Polos to China to find out. let me just briefly answer the last two questions, and then I think I can try to combine some comments for the panelists. On the increasing agricultural productivity prior to the Chinese industrialization, there were actually two elements to this. One, yes, there was a big shift after China adopted household responsibility farming system. That is after decades of collective farming where productivity was stagnant and per capita consumption, green consumption, hardly caught up with population growth, which was rapid. So the shift in that production, in that system, unleashed tremendous productivity. At the same time, what's very important, I think this was the discussion in Professor Musso's comments. What happened was also because of the migration policy that rural population were not allowed to move into cities, the surplus labor in the countryside, which were good labor, well-educated, healthy, they were trapped in the countryside, and they were not allowed to do other things. So as soon as the economic reforms began, not only rural productivity increased by more efficient farming, but more importantly, the surplus labor was able to move into what's called a township and the village enterprise. So this makes China different from the industrialization in the West, which is industrialization occurred at the same time with migration. So people moved to cities. But the Chinese industrialization, the first phase in the 1990s, most important, was what I call the industrialization in situ. They were trapped in the countryside, and that's where they produced exports, produced the Chinese first generation of Chinese capitalists in the countryside. So two things were happening at the same time, and that prepared really for this very rapid growth in the non-farming sector. Now, on the budget for defense, I think, well, first let me make a disclaimer. I'm not I'm not an expert on Chinese politics. I don't claim to be. I think two things. One is why economic growth for China is so important. So even with all the calls for this change, that change, China has set a very high goal for economic growth, like this year around 5%, which is still very ambitious. Because you saw in one of the graphs I presented, the Chinese government realized it's only with rapid economic growth or decent growth, they could have continued revenue increase, which would support not just increasing social spending along with the status of the Chinese, whether it's middle income, upper middle income, the society. And so they would still have time for resources for defense spending. So that's why I think this government revenue power, economic power is very much behind this economic growth. It's not just increasing standard of living, right? It's really about increasing state power. And why that is important, not only for social spending, for social stability, but also for defense. So the Chinese defense expenditure has been relatively high and has not slowed down, I think for two reasons. One is the goal of unite Taiwan. So China needs to have, whether it's going to do it or not, that's a separate issue. But in order to do that, China needs the maritime power, and it's already exercising that. Also, you have to understand, here I'm not criticizing the Italians, you have to understand the Chinese history, which is repeatedly taught to the Chinese younger generation That is starting from the Opium War and then to the Allied forces to Beijing in 1900. Italy was one of the 8 countries that sent army. I mean, why would Italy send army to go to Beijing? So, and then it burned down. Nothing but the old Summer Palace was designed by Matteo, right? It's designed by the Italians. Anyway, so I don't think the Chinese hate Italians per se, but this painful history of humiliation is very much in people's mind. Now with the size of China, the pride is very important, so national defense, I think it's never going to suffer. So even with the revenue slowing down, I doubt if I were in Beijing, I would support continued building up of the military, even though China does not want to have wars with its neighbors. But just for the nationalistic history, the mentality, I think there would be a lot of support in the among politicians for strong national defense, right? So I think defense spending would continue even with economic slowing down. So Professor Bukovsky, you were asking about, I have to say this, then I move on. You asked about what happened with the anti-rightists you claim you don't understand. We actually have an anti-leftist movement in the United States right now, going after universities. It's the same, right? So going after people who think. So the anti-rightist movement Professor Bukovsky mentioned occurred in 1957. 350,000 people called intellectuals were sent to the state farms or sent to exile. 350,000 is a large number because at that time, China did not have that many educated intellectuals. So this is really the same thing during the Cultural Revolution. Americans and I think the world now are comparing what's happening in the United States to the Cultural Revolution. It's basically you have a unchallenged leader leading a war against its own bureaucracies, state machines, law, police, security, but mostly people think against the universities. So we have the same thing that's happening several decades apart across different countries. So I lived through the Cultural Revolution. I was a sent down youth for 3 years. I was a villager for 3 years. Now I work in the American university and experiencing the same thing. I was not old enough to live through Mussolini and Stalin. Oh, well, I was born after. So like Massimo. Okay, so about Deng Xiaoping. How many of you have heard of the name of Oriana Fallaci?
Yeah, Oriana Fallaci.
Fallaci, Oriana Fallaci. Okay. In 1980, I just checked with my secretary, ChatGPT, because I want to verify my memory. In 1980, he interviewed Deng Xiaoping. That was still considered one of the best, the most complete interviews Deng Xiaoping gave to a foreign journalist. Among other things, he talked about how Mao should be assessed. This is only 3 years after his third time coming out of a purge, right? And also he talked about himself. He said he made many mistakes. Many of the mistakes Mao made, he was part of it. So he was very frank about his own role. So I'm not here to defend Deng Xiaoping for 1989, but he's just like any other regular person but is honest for his mistakes and for, I don't think he actually bragged about his leadership, his achievement, right? But I think China was very lucky to have a leader like Deng Xiaoping. I wrote about this, only a few pages in the book. I think the most telling thing is Mao never really liked or knew the West. he went to Moscow twice and was not treated well by Stalin. Stalin did not see him for 10 days. Deng Xiaoping, along with the Zhou Enlai, were the two leaders, top leaders, who actually spent time in the West. So Deng Xiaoping was in France for, I think, 6 years, and Moscow 1 year, during his earlier years. So he saw a society that people could live on a different system. So that personal experience, I think it's not replaceable. So one anecdote, I don't know whether I cite this or not. In 1974, he was released from exile and to come back to lead Chinese foreign affairs. So he went to the UN Special Assembly in September in 1974, and his plane had to come through Europe. So he passed by Paris on the way back, 1974. The time before refrigerators and toast ovens in China, and microwaves. So this is what Deng Xiaoping said. He asked the embassy staff to go out and to buy 100 croissants. And he would take them back in his plane to Beijing and to share with his comrades who spend time in the West. I think that's very telling. He's a very kind of quiet person, but it's very telling. Right? Okay, so enough about Italy and Deng Xiaoping. Coming back to the comments there, I think Professor Farina and Musu, the questions, some of your questions actually answer each other. That is why the Chinese youth now are tangping, laying flat, and not having children. It's not because you have to have women to be willing to get married, to have children, right? So I think the very important issues that Professor Farina addressed about this gender dimension, both the contributions of women and then also the consequences of both this, the decades of prosperity brought. It's complex. It's not just how they are. Women are commodified, right? What you call the naturalization of gender roles. Now, what they have to do, but also the empowerment during the, both actually because of the one-child policy, unexpectedly, and also of the expansion of the Chinese educational system. Now, Chinese women are like women in most societies. They're smarter, they work harder, because I'm not here just because my wife Hayo is here. 12 years ago, starting from 2013, more Chinese women are enrolled in universities than Chinese men. So I think that's quite common. I'm not sure about Italy, in the US, Japan, it's the same thing, right? So you have this, what's called, I call it not quite a feminist society, superimposed by a patriarchal state. Now, if you look at the composition of the most powerful party, body of Chinese Communist Party, the Politburo, it has 24 members, no woman, right? Yeah. So, and then they are telling women, you should have 3 children. And given how stressful life is, because I think we have to look at this in history. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you work hard, you can see the returns, because this is during high growth period. I think Japan, Korea, other societies, both all experience this. So you want to work hard, and then you get returns. And now the opportunities have become less. Not, I think, just because of slowing down is natural to some extent. So you cannot have double-digit salary increase year after year after 10 years, right? So people, I think young people are still trapped with expectation of the past. So I think this is really the morning after. They're waking up, and you do not get the same returns as you continue to work so much harder. And also depending who you are, where you are. So I think a lot of people somehow got into this habit of just working hard, and that contributes to the social stress, and then to people not getting married, not having children. And the other part is really, I think people are rebelling, young people are rebelling against this, what's called a 996. I go to China, I see people work overtime all the time. I mean, Japan also, right? Especially women. So they leave no time for social life and for life. So I think young people are rebelling by, making life choices. So I think that's one of the major underlying, very gender-specific force that's driving low fertility and this accelerated population aging in China. So I think those two are actually kind of match together quite well. Now, we have so many other questions, but I think they all said so well, and then it's time, and I should just end right there.
I thank you, Wang Feng, for animating this session. I really hope that this is the first of other encounters and discussions on China. This academy is very interested in establishing relations with the Chinese scholars. So I think this will be one of the occasion of opportunity, golden opportunity for discussing so many issues. Thank you very much. I thank also the panelists. I thank the people who have attended the session. And I think it's 7:30 now, and we must close our happy session. Thank you very much, Wang Feng, and come back again with us.